Dive straight into this and share some really interesting insights, and please feel free to interact, ask questions as we go through. Tom can give us the prompts and we can surface those questions if they're not already surfaced. But if there's anything of interest, please, happy to chat through the session and after the session and anon. From a brief agenda point of view, what we really want to dive into is actually embracing the hacker mindset. There's an awful lot of things that we can learn from the hacker mindset at this moment in time. We're going to actually put some context to that before we actually get into the hacker mindset. What we're really trying to understand is how the landscape is changing and how that is very much going to evolve through 2024 and beyond. We're going to be looking at whether the past is a good indicator, the changes that are taking place at this moment in time, the advent, obviously, and the augmentation of AI and the acceleration of those tool sets and of those data streams, how that is going to potentially impact the cybersecurity strategies we are all working on avidly at this moment in time. And some of the gaps that we can see, some of the potential gaps, and how we can obviously evolve our strategies, our investments in cybersecurity, and our thought processes going into the year ahead. It's a really important period of time for us in terms of really thinking that, learning from the past, learning from others, using those experiences to help shape this. And certainly one of the tools I found very powerful in my career, and certainly in cybersecurity, is using the Boston Consulting Grid and a 9-box matrix associated with that. And when we think about cybersecurity, we've clearly got a broadening spectrum. We're seeing a lot more activity around user identity, around supply chain, certainly moving into the center of focus for 2024. We're seeing more activity targeted towards cloud services, multi-cloud services, and operational technology environments, so energy, utilities, manufacturing, public services. If they can disrupt those national critical infrastructure in countries, that has a knock-on effect that affects us all. And again, we're seeing very key emphasis, and particularly the acceleration and the volumetrics around AI in endpoint, in application and infrastructure. So we've actually broken this grid down here. We're looking at the exploitation, complexity and process, the effort that organizations, entities, nefarious actors, threat actors have got to invest to do reconnaissance all the way through that cyber kill chain in terms of affecting organizations. And we move from straightforward through moderate and into complex, okay? If they've got to invest that amount of time, then clearly the potential gain in their process thought has to be worthwhile. And therefore the other scale is very much looking at exploitation value, where we move through low, medium and high as a means of return. Correspondingly, we see business impact also increasing as exploitation value increases, and obviously the gains for potential nefarious actors increase too. When we look at the low level, what we see is AI automation very much driving, the deception around supplier invoices. That is definitely going to increase, as it has done in 2023 through into 2024. And again, if you look at phishing, if you look at SQL injection, if you look at password attacks, what we're seeing is that AI can augment that, can improve considerably the effectiveness, the language, the context of what's being applied, whether it's a supplier invoice or it's using elements of brute force and disruption into a business in order to move the reconnaissance further on and understand the business, obviously with a view to moving up the exploitation value scale there on the left. You also see a lot more activity and complexity focused on supply chain attacks, where they're targeting smaller partners, where obviously they can get in, they can do further reconnaissance, and all those organizations may not have been as reactive or responsive in terms of resolving zero-day exploits or other vulnerabilities that they may have within their own environments in order to move through the supply chain. As we move up the value chain here, what we're looking at is a lot more organizations, and this very much leverages off 0 day. So if you look at the recent Citrix Bleed environment, so credential harvesting and session token hijacking and access here, not only was there a key vulnerability in NetScaler and Citrix environments, but they were also targeting getting to the persistent sessions, and that was the second part of the vulnerability remediation for many organizations. If you didn't do that, and they could still actually get through that, they could bypass multi-factor authentication, whichever solution organizations did use, have used, are using, then they can actually get to those persistent sessions, and it isn't just Citrix, it's other application services where those may be applicable, and again where they can actually harvest elements of token and reuse. And as we see the acceleration in the later part of this presentation in terms of AI and Copilot use, and using elements of that in terms of, you know, GitHub and Copilot for GitHub and acceleration of coding, of which there are many benefits, actually leaving tokens in there is a key risk, which we'll come on to. And what they're doing is then using manipulation. So malware either for disinformation or malware through other sources of access that people are looking at, whether that be image-based as opposed to text-based, as it has more so in 2022 and 2023. We're going to see much more focus on the malware within the image context in 2024, but also acquiring those MFA tokens, whether through, and this is why it's in the medium category, through misconfiguration and exfiltration, or social engineering. And we're seeing obviously the context of that, and we'll be presenting some more information on it. All of this is around exploitation, with a key objective for most of that within process, nefarious and threat actors, to move up the value chain as far as they possibly can. And when we think about that top level really is the same in 23 as it is in 2024, where they're trying to move into higher levels of extortion. And we're going to obviously talk through some aspects of that. There are increasing elements of IP and customer informational threats and theft. Cryptojacking has been quite volatile in 2023. Obviously, the market for crypto has been volatile. That may continue in 2024. And we're seeing more targeted effort and emphasis placed on operational technology for a number of reasons. They can be more disruptive with it. Vulnerabilities are much harder to fix. These are typically passive networks with longer standing vulnerabilities. If they can reach them, if they can see them, again, it would be a high value target for them, but it's much more complex. We're seeing much more sophisticated ransomware and data encryption related attacks. And again, we'll be talking through that later in the slide, but they are of the highest value to the nefarious and threat actors. And they're also of the highest impact to customers of any size at this moment in time. So this paints a very simplified picture of how the organizations that are looking at you, that are doing reconnaissance, that are doing weaponization, are thinking about moving through, obviously, the organization, not necessarily targeting the weakest link, but using that as a stepping stone to get further on within supply chain or within the organization, or the spectrum of technology, to see how far they can take this for highest impact and potential highest exploitation value. Okay, so when we think about 2024, it's one aspect of this, one potential visualization of this is to look at what we call within the cyber fraternities the threat and the process activities, the TTPs that are often used in terms of how organizations analyze, do reconnaissance, and piece together the elements of an attack. And this feeds very much into the hacker mindset here. So what we're looking at is the changing patterns going into 2024. What have they learned? And again, we'll come on to how this feeds into the mindset itself, and how are they applying it to both reconnaissance and the rest of the cyber kill chain. I'm going to start in the yellow in the top right-hand corner there. So very much looking at the weaknesses here. So many of you may have seen or heard of certainly attacks in 2023 that have been double or triple level extortion attacks. So this is very much looking at extending beyond those double and triple level extortion attacks. And that's attacks at 2 or 3 levels within the organization. And those progressing now to 4 or 5 layers of extortion, principally around ransomware. So this could be disruption to the business as one layer. It could be social engineering as a secondary layer. As a tertiary layer, it's malware and it's reconnaissance that it is abstracting and exfiltrating data into a 4th layer. And a 5th layer would be, you know, encryption and ransomware that's deployed within the organization to maximize the impact, you know, of that and maximize the potential exploitation value. So it's absolutely key that we look at some of the weaknesses here to improve our posture and reduce, obviously, the risk. Regularly testing IR plans, but what we're increasingly seeing is recovery plans not being linked to that. So again, bringing in and resolving that weakness, a relatively easy both ask and response for most customers of any size. What we are starting to see is this polyglot malware, and polyglot is very much the amalgamation of different threat profiles and different vectors within attacks, very much driven by large language models, part obviously of the AI elements that organizations now have access to, whether good or bad level organizations, and supply chain attacks based on file transfer. So a lot is electronic. We've obviously seen much earlier in the year, March 2023, the Move It elements and that being targeted. And again, that was an example of an organization that had a vulnerability, a service provider in this case. The vulnerability wasn't resolved in a more timely fashion. And again, the nefarious actors knew exactly where it was, had infiltrated and exposed and exploited the vulnerability, and had actually started to exfiltrate data through the vulnerability itself and transferred data out to exfiltrate that, and then completed the ransom on the organizations. But we have also seen in 2023, and we're going to see increasing amounts of this in the TTPs and the changing patterns, more social engineering. If you look at the very large scale, very complicated attacks that took place in the casinos this year, there's a large amounts of social engineering, and some of it very, very aggressive social engineering, very targeted from a social context point of view against board members and IT admin and finance teams in terms of information that they had using psychological manipulation. And a lot of this is starting to feed into the tools from an AI threat point of view that we are starting to see evolve, and evolve really quickly. So it's the acceleration of these large language models. We'll come on to talk about those in more details, where they're starting to use the technology for voice scams. So AI generated social engineering, so phoning help desks and that being indistinguishable from the real person from the AI generated version. The adoption, acceleration of dark web, unrestricted AI tools, tools that we can't necessarily see until they're used. Some tools definitely already in use, Fraud GPT, Worm GPT, very, very much accelerating. And we've seen mass scaling out in the last few months of phishing and quishing campaigns, so the use of image-related QR codes, which is obviously defeating if it's not picked up by text-only tools, if organizations haven't been able to update or add multiple tools on there. In terms of driving scams, in terms of the use of AI to improve the context, the language, the spelling errors that are more easily identifiable as red flags. So the authenticity is much harder to determine. And again, no matter how much emphasis you put on cyber awareness training, etc., because that sophistication gap has increased and the differences that people would normally spot in context and language, it's really difficult to determine between the two. And we've seen a level of increase uptick in their level of success. We've also seen that social engineering feed into insider threats and methods that have been used. And this is very much described in TTP terms as the silent surge. So not only are you seeing this going back to the triple and 4 and 5 layer extortion related attacks, but we're seeing this combined with image, and that can be just rollover image and then the malware comes through underneath. It could be quishing, which is the use of QR codes, obviously embedded images within there, and again elements of code, malware, etc., coming down, but they're very, very targeted. So this is context that you're looking at, immediately picking up on it and actually relaying that and putting something very similar into the feeds of individuals that they're seeking to target. And you're seeing also the social engineering lead into what's called living off the land driver. So they actually land within the organization, they find a weakness, they find a way in, they've stolen a token, they've hijacked credentials, and they're actually trying to do reconnaissance within the business. Their immediate element is not to disrupt, it is actually to evade being detected within the organization, move around, establish themselves, acquire more credentials, enumerate and acquire elevated credentials. And they're using some of that by actually starting very much earlier on within the process. And this is where obviously the exploitation of Copilot and introducing backdoors into code is becoming increasingly used. And then targeting also risky people within an organization, people that can be influenced from an insider threat point of view. And it's important that we think about this, from a response point of view and TTPs in terms of risky IDs, roles and areas of the business could be more frequently targeted. We know that IT admins and finance teams are very heavily targeted. That will not change in 2024. Other areas of the business that could have access to sensitive data or certainly credentials to ease the pathway into any organization or supply chain will also be targeted. But there's also a need for us to apply in real time more threat intelligence, to integrate that into our incident management processes and also the automated response. We know, and this still stands in 2024, that earlier we can disrupt the cyber kill chain, the more effective we can be in stopping the attack and minimizing the loss and or disruption to any given business, and therefore applying greater emphasis on protecting brand and identity if we're seeing it from the outside rather than the inside. And again, proactively hunting for these weaknesses, these threats within the organization, and resolving or putting in place processes, particularly with the accelerated adoption of AI that we're seeing pretty much universally across all companies. So hopefully the slides are moving on, and I'm actually going to pause at this point in terms of 2023. We've got some useful stats, but Tom, if I can just ask you to put the first poll up. Obviously, yep. Got a view of IT security expenditure in 2023 and increasing. Lots of organisations continuing to increase. The lion's share of those organisations, nearly 2/3. A good number of people increasing above 10% of investment, but also an equal number of organisations with no change or even decreasing expenditures. So, Tom, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first poll, and then feeding back when we've had a period of time as to what the results are telling us from the audience.
Yep, that poll should be live with everyone now.
How are we doing?
Okay, I'll close it now. So we've got actually 2/3 saying that security investments are going to stay the same at the moment. So that's the majority, and then 1/3 to increase security investments.
Okay, so in our research that we've been doing across both people in the industry and our customer base, we actually identified a slightly larger increase going above 10% of investment. Not a dissimilar proportion, though, showing that they're increasing it, but it's about staying the same. And again, the elements of no change and decreasing absolutely reducing. The really big question is, where is this increasing investment being targeted? Well, when we start to compare the areas of concern in organizations and where investment is being targeted, I'm going to pick out the top elements of all of this, and that is very much around encrypting key vaults, and we've seen increased activity in 2023, and we're going to see it in 2024 on key vault compromise, particularly around cloud storage accounts and the management of that, because there's any number of tools, and when we talk about key vaults, there's lots of password consolidation tools which may or may not be secure, particularly within browsers, where we're trying to consolidate and secure the management of all of those passwords, because they will become bigger targets. Looking at real-time, end user behavioral analysis or behavioral monitoring, that's another key area of investment that we're seeing. Threat intelligence advisory as well, very much feeding into this, really trying to understand what's taking place in the landscape before it affects you. But the top two investments by a considerable margin that we are seeing and certainly being fed back to us, SIEM and MXDR services, as well as content disarming and reconstruction. So this is very much reflecting the threat vectors that we are seeing around phishing and QR and image-related attacks taking place, and previous traditional text-based images being unable to be detected as they come through, the image-related scanning unable to be understood by the text-based engines and query tools that are currently in some organizations. Forgive me, I was trying to get that the right way around. But it's about how you take that image apart and you reconstruct it to understand where that image is then obviously taking, the end user, recipient of the information through, and obviously removing anything that may or may not be harmful or suspicious. So let's actually take this to the next level down. So when we actually look at this from a malware point of view, so there's a lot of emphasis upon ransomware, but what we can actually see here, and this is the global trend in terms of malware reported incidents, and the scale on the left-hand side in the millions gives you a greater context of that. Clearly, we're not finished 2023. But it will show a significant increase as it has done in 2022. Now, if we actually look at the business impact associated with successful malware attacks, You can see that the top categories there, unsurprisingly, around data breaches, around reputational damage, and the nefarious actors absolutely know and target those elements. The loss of business revenue, and although we're seeing some catch up from cyber insurance policies for obviously business disruption and business disruption revenue protection, there is still a gap there for organizations, or there might be limits that organizations are not aware of. But also denial of service is still extremely high, as well as ransomware payments. But in 2023, we've seen a reduction overall in the number of ransomware payments. I think Blackbuster announced earlier this week, that there are over 100 million in revenue payments. Some of the larger organizations and nefarious threat actors, much higher than that, which I'll come on to later in the slides. Regulatory fines, less successful in terms of business impact or how people are looking at this, largely because they've intercepted an attack, and obviously they're able to prove that they've taken reasonable steps there. So the business impact is still around data, very much and around reputational and brand impact. But actually, when you start to look at, so how do we improve the organizational posture, and how do we reduce risk through enhanced or better malware threat protection, you can see here across the bottom scale that this is a scale of adding more malware engines to different products and services, protecting your organizations. And actually the difference between 80% and nearing to 100%, nothing guarantees you, clearly, anything in this marketplace right now. It's really hard, and actually managing that number of malware engines is a considerable overhead. But if you actually look at how organizations have deployed malware engines, you can see this peak in the middle here between 6 and 20 malware engines, typically where most organizations are operating at this moment in time. A significant drop off, obviously, towards the higher end of the scale, above 20 for organizations. And you can see those marginal gains there on the previous chart. So actually just putting more malware engines into the business doesn't actually, it moves you closer to 100%, doesn't solve the underlying problem. But actually this is also reflective of the fact that this isn't going to solve the challenges in 2024 around AI and around obviously social engineering being two of the key aspects that we also need to focus on here. So what are some of the changes that we're going to see immediately? Well, the first thing to do is look at where some of these attacks in 2023 have come from. Now, there's aspects of this that are changing rapidly with geopolitical changes that are either ongoing or are emerging at this moment in time. We've certainly seen from some of the nefarious actors within the Chinese areas, continued use of the tactics around zero-day exploitations and them being much more aggressive and much faster at actually taking advantage of that. Some of those around the network elements at Fortinet at the beginning of 2023, there was a number of days associated with organizations trying to understand that and patch those devices. If you look later in the year, where we've had zero-day exploits in the Chrome browser, obviously in Citrix, etc., or edge networking devices, they are already exploiting those on a considerably larger, more aggressive scale within hours of that becoming evident to those nefarious actors, and even ahead of obviously vendors announcing patches or updates. They're very much focused on targeting more levels of supply chain compromise and large-scale botnets, looking at data theft and customer interception of data as well through proxies. We're also obviously seeing continued geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine. We've also seen a lot of activity behind those organizations. Some of you might have noticed that some of the largest police activities, international crime agency activity, has been most successful in arresting nefarious actors actually in Ukraine in the last few months, in terms of some of the campaigns that have been run on a global basis. But those activities are still continuing to see intense focus on intelligence gathering, disruption and disruptive attacks. These are long-standing, obviously, geopolitical issues that are being targeted, but they're being used to very much target defense, civil society, utilities and energy, government, not-for-profit entities. And we've seen that with the recent Boeing issue. Boeing spent a vast amount of money on its security protection, and obviously that was very much targeted by nefarious actors within that sector. We've certainly seen some changes in the Korean landscape, and that's identified very much targeted towards financial services and cryptocurrency transactions, and also blockchain now as well. And the augmentation, the advent of AI also presents as an issue there because of the public key encryption that's embedded, very much in those solutions. But also the transition of funding from nation state sponsored to self-reliance in terms of focusing on supply chains and very much scaling out activities. And again, we've seen further Middle Eastern political instabilities accelerating malicious activity. And as we'll come on to talk about in a second, the emergence of new threat actors and the convergence of a lot of the alliances and the affiliates within those alliances, and the sharing of information and knowledge very much to accelerate the impact that they can have on businesses on a global basis. So what does this look like when we actually look at the threat actors, and what can we learn from this? Well, we come into 2023 and go into 2024. There's some very big names here. There are lots of other names which we'll come on to, or certainly a few of them. But those that have been most prevalent within the last 12 months, around Cobalt, around Lockbit, around Lazarus, Scattered Spider, which is a global organization and entity, hence it hasn't got necessarily associated geopolitical bias. The Evil Corp and Black Cat and Alpha V, who have come together very much to obviously share information. We've seen the emergence, through 2023 of other aspects, and obviously the changing nature of this in terms of dark side, previously being referred to as Fancy Bear, now being more commonly referred to as ATP 28. COP, Revel and Fin 7 actually coming together, and Side Copy very much coming to the fore of this. So how is this changing going into 2024? Well, we're seeing massive adoption from a dark web point of view of social engineering tactics, the use of generation AI, info stealers and manipulation of data and information, as well as quantum computing. Quantum computing, much more of a longer term issue for what we're talking about here, but when we actually break this down, we break it down into these areas that we need to be thinking about in terms of changing aspects. So social engineering very much focused on the personal, the extended, and the protection and detection of activities in that space. From a generative AI point of view, it's about overloading systems, it's about forcing objectives, trying to break original models that are built within AI. Actually, the deception or indeed the misplacement of transcripts from private meetings. There was an example of Samsung a few weeks ago. They'd had a ban on using, obviously, the OpenAI technologies. The very senior members of the organization wanted to lapse that and really test and see the benefits of that. And unfortunately, a private meeting transcript emerged very quickly into the OpenAI and public domain. You're also seeing a lot of source code exploits coming through there. So exfiltration of data and harvesting of tokens for people that have just overcopied or shared more than they needed to in terms of the code they want to evolve or they want to seek support with. Chat history, so looking at the data retention areas, AI can obviously analyze that, and it's where that information is going, as well as IP leakage through and into copyright. Massive investment going into malware in 2024, decoy malware, downloader images, QR and quishing, modification of SEO tactics, so not just domain squatting, but changing SEO tactics to capture more information. Elevation of spoofing of private keys. So we've seen obviously through 2023 a massive acceleration in terms of changing of certificates, underwriting certificates, spoofing certificates, and greater use, continued use of Juniper and PowerShell elements to manipulate information. Longer term, quantum computing is going to push into encryption fracking. We've seen obviously this year RSA, the most sophisticated, most comprehensive cryptography, broken within 24 hours, and that's the most sophisticated that we have right now in terms of quantum computing. Harvest now, decrypt later, so stealing the data and then working all of that through. Asymmetric encryption, unless we're keeping up with those standards, unless you're evolving that, becoming a potential weakness, as well as blockchain, very public key obviously, and crypto key agility. So how do we actually see this changing, from a CloudGuard point of view? Well, actually, we're seeing a lot of movement within the organizations. And they're not only combining these alliances, but they're sharing more information together. Microsoft, in October this year, very much indicated their real concerns around the elevation of Octo Tempest. And that is an amalgamation You see on the right-hand side there, Evil Corp, Scattered Spider, Octopus, Black Cat, and Alpha V. Now, they were already involved in the casino breaches. They'd probably been understanding and doing reconnaissance for over a year within those organizations. And again, they shared information and they were able to scale out. So they didn't just target 1 or 2 casinos, they targeted 10. And, that presents a really, really major world challenge, for us all in terms of how these organizations are now working together. And again, we're seeing the emergence of new entities in all of this, the Cyber Avengers, Forest Blizzard, Black Suit, the element that calls themselves Michael Kors, and Akira as well. So those elements are going to be very important for us to track. That's why threat intelligence is so important for us to build into our plans for 2024. So how does that open up gaps? What should we be looking at here? So you're going to see a lot of AI start to come into this because it is very, very active. What we're seeing is these large language models, solution, evolution, accelerating through both volumetric AI-driven attacks as well as the sophistication of those attacks. Many of the 2023 compromises have taken place in businesses that have had really significant cyber investments, but because the landscape is evolving, so rapidly, no place for complacency. I'll come back to the earlier point, focus on the 3 R's: response, resolution, and recovery. And the recovery element is so important to keep testing and testing regularly, assessing the gaps and silos between security entities, which threat actors are targeting, actively targeting, and actually monitoring those for evasion techniques as much as you are for security policy changes. Putting additional monitoring in on persistent accounts and token access, token resets, password, multi-password resets for multi-geo IPs. Implementing secure code verification, particularly where you're using AI and the benefits of AI to accelerate that, and looking at increased log correlation. And this ties back to SIEM and XDR being top investments alongside understanding behavioral use analysis. And Sentinel is an amazing product at doing that. But if I had one takeaway from this in terms of the biggest gap, have a tested incident and response and recovery plan for your organization. Go away, work with a partner now to get the best practices in place and accelerate that into your organization and regularly test that. Okay, so what do these changes do and how do they play out? Well, we see AI as positive and potentially negative here. In the blue, the positive, the orange, the negative. Large language models very much underpinning this, being utilized in a nefarious way to generate much larger, much more sophisticated attacks with social engineering. It's being linked to phishing, QR, and image-related activity, as well as non-legitimate voice scamming and voice outreach, to obviously avoid detection. It eradicates a lot of the areas that we've tested and we've become used to in 2023 and looking at to detect malicious activity. And we're seeing much more automation to disrupt. Positively, lots of data synthesis, lots of increased context from threat intelligence linked to actionable response that we can put in place to complement humans to obviously head off the issues of the sophistication and the volumetrics that are taking place here, to complement human expertise as well. Identifying new data overlays in the business, which will come on to with AI, and obviously reducing delays and handoffs between human or process information when we're looking at tracking and understanding behavioral patterns that may not be what we want them to be or have breached a particular threshold outside of the norm activity that we're looking on. And I thought I'd share this from a CloudGuard point of view, how we are protecting organizations at this moment in time, something you can elevate, something that you can take away in terms of the continual cycle of continual cyber posture evolution and risk reduction in your businesses through automation and through optimization. And again, the continual plans being driven by prioritizing, by tuning, by automating, by looking at the tool sets that you need to evolve shorter term commitments on those, optimizing and truly hunting and putting that into a continual process within your organization through 2024 and beyond. Why is that so important? Well, actually, let's understand the hacker mindset, because this gives us a really interesting insight into how they operate and think. And actually, they have a number of mantras that we can take an awful lot from. And one of them is the power of good enough. They don't go for perfection. and they look on an opportunistic level, and it is all about timing. Typically, they are looking for indecision, procrastination, and delays within organizations and security policies. Organizations that can't patch straight away, that delay that because of potential operational impacts, etc. Those are the elements that present them with opportunities, and it's weakness within our organizations, which they're becoming far more sophisticated and adept at responding to. Believe it or not, and we obviously see this from both sides, it is not about the goal or outcome. It's not necessarily about financial gain, because a lot of nefarious actors actually just sell information on in terms of reconnaissance, and the monetization chain goes into other affiliates. It's about the process, and it's understanding the motivation in that process. They're not actually too concerned about the concern or the impact. That's not shared with them. They use a different lens. So please don't think along the same lines as we do. Adopting an external perspective. So they look through the supply chain. They are looking at the security tools and the posture that's known. They're looking for the weakest angle that they can come into the organization, and they can obviously automate and apply their tools, right? They are thinking that you are thinking that our security posture, the tooling that we have, is good enough, and it will protect the organization. They will find a way to undermine that. One of the ways that they know is silo exploitation. So this area, particularly where you're multi-cloud, where you've got SaaS applications, where you've got a blend of hybrid technologies, they're encouraging and looking for the weaknesses between business and security teams to try to target them and exploit on that basis. So firms do have to understand the brutal facts that you may think that you are secure, but how have you confirmed that, right? So pen testing is obviously a long-term policy many organizations have adopted, but it could be down to misconfiguration. It could be down to vulnerabilities. These are complex attack paths that are being followed. If you take Boeing, if you take MGM, as world-class examples of high levels of security cyber investment, they were still ransomed. They were still compromised. So you've got to make good decisions based on the facts right at the very beginning. How are these attacks likely to evolve? And it requires opportunity identification, and that's why proactive threat hunting becomes so important in terms of thinking like this. And you will start to see, actually, a lot of the nefarious actors are starting to change their pitch. They're stopping short of ransoming organizations, and they're saying, here's the breach penalty. We can ransom you at this point. We're able to do this, but actually this is how we compromised you. And almost spinning it on its head to become consultative in terms of exploitation strategies, but actually limiting the demand, and the disruption on a business. Only some, I hasten to add, but it's pragmatic and it's a very effective solution for some of them at this moment in time. So how do we help customers? Well, it's a continual cycle, and I guess adopting this mindset helps lots of organizations. Here, we're constantly assessing, whether it's proactive or reactive, how we help accelerate changes within cyber posture and reducing risk, how we're protecting organizations, changing those tool sets, protecting organizations from supply chain, 15 employees, all the way up to our largest customers. Evolving those tool sets, evolving the analytical rules and the use cases to improve security posture and customer success. And it's through enhancing that through greater levels of automation, threat intelligence, all the way through to resolution. And we've got to resolve that, going back to those earlier vulnerability exploitations, really targeting those to be resolved, mean time to resolve, mean time to remedy those vulnerabilities as quickly as possible. And to follow metrics around continual improvement, not just threat detection. We've got to move beyond that, as metrics the industry has previously used, to look at that from a customer success perspective. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask for poll 2 come up for air at this point. Tom, if you don't mind, putting up poll 2 and introducing it.
Yep, poll 2 is launched. So the question is, are you planning to use Microsoft Copilot in the next 3 months? You should be presented with 4 choices. You've got yes, no, within the next 6 months, or no plans to use Microsoft Copilot. So if you could submit your response, that would be most useful. Thank you. Okay, I shall leave it there. And Matt, we've actually got a 50-50 split between within the next 6 months and not at all.
Thank you so much for answering that poll. Right, well, let's get into it then. Let's think about the considerations from a security point of view. Some wonderful tools. Obviously, Windows Copilot's just gone GA. Have you got employee guidelines in place in your organizations? Very few that we talk to actually have at this moment in time. And we need to be thinking about that in terms of best practice, and best practice is accelerating and very much in catch-up mode in some organizations and sectors. But again, we've got to be thinking about this. How do you get from using Copilot and the benefits to your organization to protecting it more effectively from the likes of prompt injection level attacks or image related attacks? How do you monitor the guardrails that you're putting in within your organization? Can your security tools at the moment, from an endpoint, from a user identity point of view, do all of this? And what about people that are copy pasting information into that to look for obviously responses? So really, really important things. Going to come on to some of our thoughts around that on the next slide. Obviously, Dart GPT, very, very much accelerating in terms of the scale of the chatbots, very large language model driven here. We're seeing hugely sophisticated increases in phishing emails, manipulated videos from AI, voice cloning, as we've touched on before, but now also deep fake fund transfer scams and Darkgate loader malware information taking place within these channels. So they're immediately being disrupted and exploited by the nefarious actors who are already waiting for organizations to adopt this. So it's understanding how we put the analytical rules and use cases in to monitor those additional, and they are additional channels to the ones we've been monitoring to date. We're seeing really, really rapid acceleration of what we are referring to as deep fakes and channel poisoning. So this is where they poison a model, and you've seen actually some of the breaches in the last few days with OpenAI in the public environment. And again, introducing malicious code and backdoors that they can exploit at a future date. We've also seen it from the other side, sort of over the top related attacks in terms of overrunning queries to create pollution and manipulate the original behavioral framework and modeling that was put in place in AI to train it. And obviously also coming from a data reconstruction and an inversion point of view to actually manipulate the answers and responses. And we're seeing this pushed out and cascaded in supply chain attacks, whether it's through, fake authentication and support query software and solution systems, gateway account authentication being pushed out, and then again, it's a natural extension of MFA, and enforced partner software standards, from an AI adoption point of view being seized upon by the nefarious actors. We're seeing widespread Copilot adoption from lots and lots of organizations, but again, leaked code targeting companies. So it's constantly being monitored, some of this being pushed out through other, obviously, channels that are allowed to go into the public domain, and injected backdoors and data exfiltration and copying, as well as feeding into social engineering. And that's just from a development point of view. And we're seeing great gains in organizations in using that, but it's understanding how you validate that, which we'll touch on the next slide. Teams-enabled phishing, very, very much coming to the fore now. So we're seeing Teams very aggressively adopted as a channel to influence, social engineer, and actually launch attacks through. Leveling up through invoice emails is almost top of the list at this moment in time, as is the swing from text to image-based dynamic modeling through Copilot and sending nefarious images back that are laced with malware underneath. Extending, obviously, the Bing search engine, through management policies. It's truly understanding how organizations can protect themselves from both data and image leakage, from both the search results and people obviously putting attachments in or potentially transcript information in, and what information that's policing and releasing and being scanned before it's released. And again, the effortless sort of advice here, security audit and reports on breach, how are they captured, how are they going to be reported? Using AI in itself to drive that as a consultancy services to police what you're putting out, what you're pushing out, but it is now an omni-channel, torrent of information that's also coming back to organizations. And what we're trying to understand is how you monitor some of those. Obviously, we've got tools and threat intelligence to monitor that look for potential exfiltration and exfiltration itself in terms of copied code. So when we think about the Microsoft ecosystem, hugely, hugely powerful, lots of potential in organizations. Copilot itself is a sophisticated process and orchestration engine that does provide AI-powered productivity capabilities. It uses three things principally: large language models, or LLM as we've referred to. It uses Microsoft Graph, emails, chats, documents with user view permissions, I hasten to add, as well as linkage where you've got obviously Microsoft Copilot into the productivity apps. At a very high level, to summarize this, we are pushing downwards in this chart display here, where you've got your tenant policies. Anything with view or read permission is accessible through the tools as you allow it. You have the opportunity through the admin portals that I'll come on to obviously say whether that is pushed out in public domains or what plugins you use from a Copilot point of view. Microsoft is using three things. So it's using large language models, it's using Microsoft Graph, and it's using a derivative of OpenAI. So Azure OpenAI, which is using the ChatGPT 4 version 4 turbo algorithm as of next week. And again, you can link that through to Bing queries that can go out into the public domain. And that's very much one of the gains around ChatGPT version 4 in turbo mode that's obviously being published. Obviously, you can enable different Copilot plugins, so it's looking at the veracity of those, and you can manage data, because it is really, really important here that you look at data from a pure view point of view, because that's where sensitivity labeling and classification of data needs to have taken place in your organization, with the relevant and appropriate applied levels of encryption there in the first orange box. The use of information rights management, hopefully many of you are familiar with this, and again, linked very clearly into pure view. Looking at 365 isolation controls to obviously control the elements of Copilot, and code verification coming through, which is available to you in the 365 admin console. So our recommendations here in terms of Copilot adoption and review, very much looking at a data review here. So it's super, super critical that you look at this from a sensitivity label point of view and apply all of those before that data is going out, so you can track that. Without that, it's extremely difficult to track all of the elements that we've been talking about here. To look at obviously the review of the Copilot plugins and the guidelines and policies that people have got. Obviously, you've got to do this very quickly. So whether or not the cyber awareness training tools you have this capability in it, you may have to look at other tools, particularly policies around transcript recording. Obviously, Copilot enables you to virtually attend meetings now. So obviously that's a transcript enabled process. We're looking at data retention of all of those and understanding Microsoft's own copyright commitments. Absolutely imperative, get guidelines and guardrails in place before you do it, and to go test that, right? Because as an organization, one of the key questions that's being asked is, who does own the copyright to AI generated innovation, particularly if you're using the digital and the app innovation Copilot. The use of transcript elements, once that's out, if it gets out into the public domain, case in point, the Samsung organization, recording AI generated content and images, having that database and log as to where it's come from, should it need to be referenced in the future from a legal or other point of view. Looking at monitoring that, so these key elements here, won't go through all of them, but again, what's downloaded, what's uploaded, how is it labeled, policy and compliance checks that are being put in place, isolation and scanning controls for information and activities that you think breach those policies. AI does have some guardrails naturally within it. You need those before it gets there. And the independent code checks. And from a control point of view, informational rights management, generation of those content labels for new content is also something to seriously consider here, as well as policing and managing the plugins and the alliance to the privacy policies within your organization and Microsoft PureView. So very simply, to sum up, the advice is always the same. The earlier we can see issues, whether you're using Copilot, AI related, or any other cyber activity, the earlier we can intervene, the bigger the risk reduction is to your organization. It is increasingly about responsiveness. The adoption of AI being case in point there, we have to be more responsive. We have to enable our organizations, our security teams, our IT teams, our business teams to be more responsive and more collaborative together. We can only achieve that through automation to prevent that lateral movement and that data exfiltration. And we have to be embedding more threat intelligence, whether you do that through a partner and it's correlated and it's augmented into your automated response, or human expertise that can then take obviously a position within the business. As ever, CloudGuard are here to help you, protect, to evolve, to automate. Please don't delay, because the threat actors are not delaying. They are accelerating rapidly. Engage today and try and keep one step ahead. For any further information, info@cloudguard.ai, please talk to any of the team. If you have any questions in the remaining minutes, very, very happy to answer that. I'll drop out the slides if that's okay.
Thank you for that, Matt. Yes, if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the chat. We have one.
Tom, do you want to read it out?
Yep. In light of the CTS breach, do you anticipate a continued focus on MSPs in 2024, and how can we look to secure supply chains?
For those of you not familiar with this particular incident, it is an ongoing incident. CTS is an expert provider to the legal services industry in the UK, approximately 200 or so customers. It has unfortunately been involved in what appears to be allegedly a ransomware attack from an unknown organization. CTS has had to take its customer systems offline now for 2 weeks. It's had a significant impact upon both customers of those legal fraternities and CTS partners themselves. Do I anticipate increased focus? I think because the nefarious actors have seen the level of disruption, going back to the OT statement I made earlier on, we will see and are seeing MSPs being actively targeted because of the magnification effect of the attack that it can have on the end customer ecosystem. So yes, unfortunately, I would have to answer that I do see MSPs being increasingly targeted.
Thank you. I did actually get another question from someone who couldn't join us today, but they wanted to know whether we had any thoughts on whether potential AI regulation, if we're worried that it could end up stifling our own use, but it actually allows the attackers to operate unchecked and obviously even further outside the law. Do you know if we have any views on that?
So I do think that there is two ecosystems. You've got these incredibly well-funded Octotempest and Scattered Spider are said to have nation states funding of over $400 million, plus all the ransom money that they've collated. I think with that, they can fund their own AI tool creation, and obviously quantum computing being very expensive. Also, that's well within their reach, within the kind of values we're talking about there. That's being independently accelerated and developed. So whether we have the regulation or not, does it affect it? I would argue not at this moment in time. So it is a continued and increasing problem. I think from our point of view, international organizations have to collaborate more effectively together in the policies, right? The guardrails on a country level just will not work, in the way that cyber criminals operate. So we've got to collaborate more effectively, and we've got to allow cyber communities to take advantage of the acceleration in AI, automation and large language models to better protect people. So there's a very, very delicate balance between the two. So I do hope there isn't a more draconian implementation of policies that restricts the innovation and acceleration of cyber security and understanding to protect people, or certainly a carve out for those people in that industry sector to help continue to protect people.
Thank you. I can see someone is typing, so we'll just see if another question appears. Here we go. So on budget availability for 2024, there was still a large portion of responses that had answered stay the same. Is there support available for consolidation of investments?
Without a doubt. So we positively encourage organizations to look at that and to consolidate. There's a significant amount of crossover. Certainly within CloudGuard, yes, we're a Microsoft specialist, but we have helped and will help organizations to review through our gap assessment services the tool sets that they have, and that can often lead to releasing existing investment to improve services and to prove the effectiveness of their cyber posture within the same budgets. Absolutely.
Okay, and I think that is actually us out of time for today.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and participating. It's really appreciated, and the responses there, I hope that's been beneficial to you. And if you have any questions for CloudGuard, please reach out to us. Happy to catch up. Thank you.